Shalom, this is part 2 of the hard sayings of Paul. Again, Peter in 2 Peter 3:16 said the Apostle Paul said things that are hard to understand. And he went on to say, people that are untaught and unstable in the scriptures, speaking of the Tanakh, the so-called Old Testament, they're untaught because that's the only Bible they had at that time, my friend. They went to the synagogue. I'm going to demonstrate in a minute here. But Peter said people that are untaught and unstable in the scriptures, they twist the things Paul said, and they will be destroyed because of that. For their misunderstanding Paul, they will be destroyed. And as I mentioned in part 1 of this video, the hard sayings of Paul, the thing they were misunderstanding were things Paul was saying concerning Yahweh's law, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. So I forgot, I want to go back and I want to talk about, I didn't mention the Gentiles in Acts chapter 21 here, when James is saying that the Apostle Paul, Acts 21, he's telling Paul to take the 4 men who were under a Nazirite vow. I want to talk about that here. The sacrifices had to be made. What sacrifices? One of them being a sin sacrifice. But I want to mention first the Gentiles. So in verse 24 again, James says, Acts chapter 21, verse 24, take the 4 men that are under a Nazirite vow, purify yourselves along with them, pay their expenses, so all will shave their heads, and all will know there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you. And what were they told? That Paul was speaking against the law and telling children they don't have to be circumcised, telling them they don't have to circumcise their children and don't have to follow the customs. And James says, show them there's nothing to the things they've been told about you, but that you yourself walk orderly, keeping the law. Verse 25. I should have probably brought this up in the last video because a lot of people thought I were probably thinking I'm ignoring it. But verse 25, concerning the Gentiles who have believed, Verse 25, concerning the Gentiles who have believed, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. And then verse 26, we go back to Paul taking the men under a Nazirite vow. Then Paul took the men the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. So first the Gentiles and then the sacrifices. Okay, the Gentiles, James says here about the Gentiles, if they do these 4 things, abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what's strangled, and from fornication, if they do these 4 things, they're doing good. Why just those 4 things? Is that all the Gentiles had to do? Did they have to honor their fathers and mothers? Did they have to do the Shabbat, observe the Sabbath? Were they allowed to lie, cheat, and steal? James didn't say anything about that in there. So what was James talking about? Why did he just mention those 4 things? If you go back to Acts 15, where James first commented on those 4 things, they're talking about the Gentiles. So Peter gets up first in Acts 15 and says, how by my mouth the Gentiles first came to hear the good news. And I'm going to pick it up in verse 13. I want to read through this kind of quickly. In verse 13, Acts chapter 15, verse 13, this is pertaining to the Gentiles. After they had stopped speaking, James answered, saying, brethren, listen to me. Simon has related how Yahweh first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. And with the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written, after these things I will return, and I will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which is fallen. I will rebuild the ruins, and I will restore it, so that the rest of mankind may seek Yahweh, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name. Thus says Yahweh, verse 18, who makes these things known from long ago. In verse 19, therefore it is my judgment, this is James speaking, who was the head of the congregation in Jerusalem at that time. When Peter went to prison, James took charge of the congregation. So James says in verse 19, therefore it is my judgment that we should not trouble those who are turning to Yahweh from among the Gentiles, but that we should write to them that they should abstain from things contaminated by idols, from fornication, from what is strangled, and from blood. In verse 21, now listen to this. For Moses, the word for there could be translated, and often is, because Moses from ancient generations has in every city those who preach him, since he is read in the synagogue every Sabbath day. So James is saying if they do these 4 things, that's good. Because Moses is preached in a synagogue every Sabbath day. What does Moses being preached in the synagogue have to do with the Gentiles and them only doing these four things? What James is saying is, as I mentioned in the past, people didn't have Bibles at this time like you got right now. You can go through the Bible and read the entire Bible in a month or two if you want. Take your time and do it in 2 months. They couldn't do that. The only time they could hear the Bible read was in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Bibles were very expensive at that time. I talked about that in a previous video. But they were very expensive. To have a scribe sit down and write down just a copy of the Gospels would have been the wages of a skilled worker, 6 weeks' wages of a skilled craftsman, like say a mason or something. It would have been 6 weeks' wages for him to hire a scribe to write down just the Gospels. People couldn't afford Bibles. So to listen to the Torah read, they had to go to the synagogue on a Sabbath. So again in verse 21, because Moses from ancient generations has in every city those who preach him, since he is read in the synagogue every Sabbath. Again, in other words, James is saying they're going to hear the rest of the commandments in the Sabbath day in the synagogues, such as honor your father and mother, not to eat unclean food as an abomination to Yahweh, in Deuteronomy 14. Unclean food. The feast days, we're told, Leviticus 21, the feast days are to be observed forever and ever. That's what they would have heard in the synagogue on a Sabbath day. Concerning the feast days, 23, I'm sorry, that's what I was looking up here. I thought I said 21. It's 23. The feast days in Leviticus 23, the whole chapter there's talking about the feast days. It says about 4 different times they're to be observed forever throughout all generations. Forever. A lot of people get the word forever confused in Hebrew. It's the word olam. And it's true, it can be translated differently than forever. But I believe the way Yahweh put it in here when he said forever throughout all your generations was for people that get confused about the word here. Throughout all your generations, is Israel still having generations? Yes. Are the feast days to be observed yet? Yes. And so in Zechariah chapter 14, in Zechariah chapter 14, Zechariah says the nations that do not come up, the nations that are left after the final battle, that's right, my friend, there will be nations in the kingdom. In Acts 21, it says, John says, I've seen the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, and Yahweh himself, God himself, is going to dwell among men. When that happens, that new Jerusalem is going to come down out of heaven. Nobody's going to heaven, by the way. Matthew 5:5, the meek shall inherit heaven? No, the earth. Over and over again. Matthew 13, the angels are going to take the wicked out from among the righteous, and then the righteous will shine forth in the kingdom of their Father. Nobody's going to heaven. The kingdom's going to be on earth. So when the new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven in Revelation 21, we're told twice there. I'll put it up here on the screen. It says God himself will dwell among men. So when I'm losing my train of thought here. Oh, the feast days. So after the feast days, after the new Jerusalem comes down, there's going to be others left on earth. The wicked are going to be taken out from among the righteous. And then the righteous in Revelation chapter 11, let me read that here if I could. The righteous are going to shine forth in the kingdom. Revelation chapter 11. I know many of you believe in a rapture theory. I'm telling you, I have an article on the website that makes it extremely clear such a thing doesn't exist. There will be a rapture. Like I mentioned in Matthew 13, Yahweh's going to send forth, Yahshua's going to send forth his angels, and they're going to take the wicked. They're going to be raptured out of here. The wicked will be raptured out from among the righteous. And then the righteous, Matthew 13, will shine forth in the kingdom. Where are they going to be at when this happens? Are they going to be in heaven? No, they're on earth. Revelation chapter 11. Revelation chapter 11, verse 15. Listen to this now. John, I got an article on this about the rapture, and you should go and read it. I don't want to spend time talking about it like I'm doing here. But anyway, Revelation 15 says, the seventh angel sounded, and there's loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of this world, that's earth, becomes the kingdom of Yahweh and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. So at the last trumpet, the seventh trumpet, Paul tells us in Corinthians 15:51, and again, this is all I'm going to say about this. Read the article. Paul says, at the last trumpet, the trumpet shall sound, and we shall be changed. In a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. How many trumpets? 7. 7. What happened at the seventh trumpet? The kingdom of this world, earth, now becomes the kingdom of Yahweh. Yahushua is going to rule for 1,000 years. He's going to restore the earth to what it should have been. And then in 1 Corinthians 15:21, it says he's going to offer the kingdom back up to the Father. And my point in saying all that was, the wicked are going to be taken out from among the righteous. Oh, this Zechariah 14. The reason I went off in that tangent, Zechariah 14, I said there will be other people in the kingdom on earth at the time in the kingdom after the 1,000-year reign. There will be other nations on earth. If you have questions, there's much more I want to say. In Revelation 22, it talks about the leaves of the nations. This is after the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. It says the leaves of the trees are going to be for the healing of the nations. What are the nations doing there? You know, years ago I read that and I thought, what nations? What are they going to be doing there? This is talking about a time when Yahweh himself is going to be dwelling on earth, and there's going to be nations there. The river is going to flow out of the eastern gate down in the Negev into the desert, and the leaves of the trees are going to be for the healing of the nations. What nations? Yes, there will be nations in the kingdom. They're not going to have eternal life. There will be those who have eternal life and those who do not have eternal life after the 1,000-year reign. I know that may sound very strange to some of you, but it's absolutely true. Absolutely true. I'll have to do a video or an article on that in the very near future. So my whole point in saying that is the Gentiles talked about in Acts 21, verse 25, when James says if the Gentiles do these four things, strangulation, blood, fornication, things sacrificed to idols, if they abstain from these things, they're doing good. He said that in Acts 15. And then he added to that, because Moses is preaching in the synagogue every Sabbath day. And the reason he said that was because they're going to hear the rest of the Torah, such as the feast days, the food laws, the Shabbat. They're going to hear that. Well, they won't have to hear about the Shabbat because they're going to be in the synagogue. In Acts 15, read that again. Go through that again. I'll put it up here on the board. I'm going to quote it, so if I get a word out of context, don't hold it against me. But in Acts 15, he says in verse 21, I believe it was there. I better go to it. Acts 15, he says in verse 21, because Moses from ancient generations has in every city those who preach him, since he's read in the synagogue every Sabbath day. In other words, the Gentiles will be going to the Sabbath day, the synagogues on the Sabbath day. They already know about the Sabbath, and they're going to hear the rest of Moses, the law of Yahweh, the feast days, food laws, and so forth, in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Trust me, nobody has to tell you when the Sabbath day is in Jerusalem, in Israel. It's like a ghost town. An hour before sundown in Jerusalem, every shop is shut down except maybe a couple Arab shops that are around in little alleyways and so forth. But it's like a ghost town. There's no questioning when does the Sabbath appear or happen in Israel. It's on the Sabbath day. The Gentiles would go to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and they'll hear the rest of the law preached. That's what John's talking about. James is talking about in Acts 15, 20 to 21, and in Acts 21, verse 25, when he said here concerning the Gentiles, if the Gentiles do these four things, they're doing good. They'll hear the rest of the law preached in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. So I wanted to talk about that, and I want to talk about what sin sacrifice is being talked about here. Well, I wish I was keeping track of my time. So let me go through this rather quickly. The sin sacrifices in Acts chapter 21, verse 26, Then Paul took them, the men that were under a Nazirite vow, purified himself along with them, and went to the temple, giving notice of the completion of days. This is exactly what you do under a Nazirite vow. We're going to go look at that. Until the sacrifices were made for each one of them. So a Nazirite vow Paul was under. I never heard anybody disagree with that. Even Christian ministers would agree with that. Paul was under a Nazirite vow, but most Christian ministers would not agree with this. They know it's a Nazirite vow, but most of them have no idea because they never went back to look what was involved in a Nazirite vow. But Numbers chapter 16, I'm going to begin reading in verse 13. The whole chapter is about a Nazirite vow, but let me begin reading in verse 13. Numbers 6:13. Now this is the law of the Nazirite. When the days of his separation are fulfilled, which is what we read in Acts 20, when the days of completion, Paul went to the temple, are fulfilled, he shall bring an offering to the doorway of the tent of meeting. He shall present an offering to Yahweh, one male lamb a year old without defect, one burnt offering, one burnt offering, one ewe lamb a year old without defect for a sin offering, and one ram without defect for a peace offering. 3 sacrifices had to be made for those under a Nazirite vow. 3 sacrifices had to be made. One was a sin sacrifice. What was Paul doing offering up a sin sacrifice 20 years after the death and resurrection of the Messiah? My friend, this is something I don't think I've ever heard a Christian minister even talk about it. Satan knows it's true, and his ministers know what I'm about to say, but Christian ministers don't. And Satan and his ministers, they don't want you to know this. They don't want you to understand this. Many people say, well, why did the Messiah die? Well, he died for sin, of course. What sin? For unintentional sin? Oh, he died for all sin. No, he did not. And we're going to go back and look at that. But first, let me read what Paul said. Paul said in Acts chapter 13. Let me read Acts chapter 13 here, verse 38 and 39. I want to begin by saying something Paul said to set the stage here for what I'm about to say. Acts 13, verse 38, Paul's talking to maybe hundreds of Jews here. He says, there let it be known to you, brethren, that through him forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. And through him, being the Messiah, everyone who believes is justified from all things which he could not be justified for through the law of Moses. Now your Bible might have the word freed in there instead of justified, but the word is literally justified. You might have a side note off to the side saying literally justified. So Paul's saying what you could not be justified for through the law of Moses, you can be justified for through this man Yahushua. That's Paul. What could you not be justified for through the law of Moses? We're going to go take a look at that right now. In Romans chapter 8 again. Romans chapter 8. I'm going to begin reading in verse 2. For the law of the Spirit of life in Messiah Yahushua, Romans chapter 8, verse 2, has set you free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and as an offering for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh. So that the requirement, verse 4, listen to this. So the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For those who are according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but these are not according to the but those who are according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. In verse 6, for the mind set on the flesh is death, but the mind set on the Spirit is life and peace. In verse 7, because the mind set on the flesh is hostile towards God, it does not subject itself to the law of God, for it is not even able to. Paul's saying in this context here, what the law could not do, the Messiah did. Yahweh did by sending his Son, that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled. What had to be fulfilled? Paul said in Acts 13 and 38 and 39 there, he says, you could not be justified by the law of Moses, you could be justified by the Messiah. What could you not be justified for through the law of Moses? Turn to Leviticus chapter 4. Leviticus chapter 4. I'm not going to read the whole chapter here, but Leviticus chapter 4, the whole thing is talking about unintentional sin. Unintentional sin. In verse 2, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally in any of the things which Yahweh has commanded not to be done and commits any of them, if the anointed priest sins, and then he goes on this whole chapter. I'm not going to read the whole chapter for lack of time. But he says, now if the whole congregation sins, verse 13, Leviticus 4:13, if the whole congregation of Israel commits error on a matter escapes the notice of the assembly, and they commit any of the things which Yahweh has commanded not to be done, and they become guilty, when the sin which they have committed becomes known, they did it unintentionally, when it becomes known to them, he goes on to say the sacrifice has to be offered. And then in verse 20, and it says, he shall also do with the bull just as he did with the bull of the sin offering, thus he shall do with it. So the priest shall make atonement for them, and they will be forgiven. If the entire congregation sins unintentionally, when it becomes known to them, they shall offer up a sacrifice, and they shall be forgiven. In Leviticus 4:22, when a leader sins unintentionally, does any of the things which Yahweh has commanded not to be done, he becomes guilty. If his sin which he has committed is made known to him, he shall bring his offering of a goat. And then he goes on to tell you how to sacrifice that in verse 26. And all of its fat shall be offered up in smoke on the altar, as is the case of the fat of a sacrifice of peace offering. Thus the priest shall make atonement for the leader of the congregation, and he will be forgiven. My friend, if you go on there, it talks about the common people in Leviticus 4:27. If they commit a sin unintentionally, they offer up a sacrifice, and in verse 31, they will be forgiven. So if somebody committed a sin unintentionally, When it comes to mind, this is important, then they have to offer up a sacrifice. What if it never comes to mind? How could they ever be forgiven for it if it never comes to mind? I'm going to show you that in a moment. Go to Numbers chapter 15 here. This is a pivotal turning point in the entire Bible that most people have never ever seen before. Numbers chapter 15, verses 1 to 29, pretty much talk about the same thing we just read in Leviticus. If somebody commits a sin unintentionally, when it comes to their remembrance, they offer up a sacrifice, and they will be forgiven. That's Numbers 15, verses 1 to 29. In 29 it says, "You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is native among the sons of Israel, and for the alien who sojourns among them." So Yahweh says there's one law for people that do things unintentionally, violate my law unintentionally. There's one law for unintentional sin, for the alien and for the native, the one law. In verse 30, he says, but, Numbers 15, verse 30, I'd like to tell you a lot of stories about my talking to Jews in Israel pertaining to this very thing. But the person who does anything defiantly, verse 30, Numbers 15:30, or high-handedly, or intentionally, arrogantly, whether he is a native or an alien, that one is blaspheming Yahweh, and that person shall be cut off from among his people. Because he has despised the word of Yahweh, broken his commandment, that person shall be completely cut off. His guilt will be upon him. So if somebody committed a sin unintentionally, the sacrifice could be made, the person can be forgiven. If somebody committed a sin intentionally or defiantly or high-handedly, there's nothing you can do for that. That's something you could not be justified for according to the law. If you sinned against Yahweh unintentionally, you could not be justified for that according to the law. So the Messiah justified us, Paul in Acts chapter 13, verse 38 and 39. What you could not be justified for through the law of Moses, you can be justified through this man Yahshua. What could you not be justified for right here what we're talking about? Intentional sin. So in Romans chapter 8, verses 3 down to verse 8 there, for Messiah fulfilled the requirement of the law. How did he fulfill the requirement of the law? Because the penalty for intentional sin is death. If you sin against Yahweh unintentionally, I know it's, Father, I should be keeping the Shabbat, but you got to understand I can make a lot of money today, so I sure hope you understand. What he understands is you have more love for your money than you do for him. You just cut yourself off from Israel. Most Christians don't even believe they have to keep the Sabbath. But you do, my friend, you do. I'm going to demonstrate that in the next series of talks about the hard sayings of Paul. Here I want to talk about the reason the Messiah had to die. The reason the Messiah died was for what the law could not do. You could not be forgiven for intentional sins. You were completely and utterly cut off. So what happened? If somebody committed a sin in Israel that was intentional, they knew what the law said, that yet you're completely cut off, and they say, what can I do, Father? How can I be reconciled back to you? I've committed a sin unintentionally, and look what you just said here. I'm completely and utterly cut off. What can I do? What's the answer? You can't offer up a sacrifice. I had Jews in Israel tell me, you pray about it. You pray about it. I said, so if somebody commits a sin unintentionally, an animal have to die. They had to offer up a sacrifice, right? And the Jew in Israel would say, yeah. But if they sin intentionally, what happens? You pray about it. So if I violate the Sabbath unintentionally, I got to offer up an animal. If I violate it intentionally, saying, you know what, I know it's wrong, I'm doing it anyway, then all I got to do is say, I'm sorry. Does that make sense to anybody? It's not true. It's not true. And what does somebody do? This is such an important point. What does somebody do when they realize that they're under the death sentence? Paul says in Romans 7, when the law came alive, I died. What can he do? He couldn't do nothing. I got articles about Romans 7, by the way, about Paul saying, the very evil that I don't want to do, Romans 7:19, I think. Paul says, the very evil thing that I don't want to do, that's what I do. People think he's talking about being a sinner. Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 9, I think, he says, according to the law, I'm blameless. I obey the law perfectly. Philippians 2, I think, verse 9. But people get Romans 7 mixed up where they think Paul's intent, the very wicked thing that I don't want to do, that I do. This is like a man out of control. I know what I'm doing is wrong and I can't stop myself. What do I do? There's many Christians that think that's exactly what he's saying. That's not at all what he's saying. He concludes Romans 7 by saying, "Oh, wretched man that I am, what am I going to do? Praise be to Yahweh. I've been delivered through Yahushua the Messiah." He's talking about when he was in his flesh, he could not stop sinning. If he was saying that about himself now as he's preaching to you, "Hi, I'm the Apostle Paul, and you know what? The wicked things that I do, I can't stop myself. And I want you to join me. Come and join me. Come and join me. Both of us will be big sinners, and we can't stop ourselves from sinning. But so what? Because we're all going to be saved." That's what Christians think. My friend, if you continue in sin, there's no salvation. Read Romans 6. It's so ludicrous to think that, but many do. I don't want to spend more time on that, but I had a fellow years ago tell me, very religious man, happened to be a cousin of mine, very religious. When I told him I did something wrong and I thought I lost my salvation, he said, "Oh no, Reuben, Paul sinned all the time." I said, "What?" "Oh yeah, read Romans 7. He thought Paul's a continuing sinner. I got articles on the website about Romans 7. Please go read them. If you think that's what Paul's talking about, please. I got a short version and a long version there. If you're really seeking the truth, read the long version. If you just want the simple truth, read the short version. So back to the Messiah. The Messiah died for what the law could not do. It could not forgive us for intentional sin. That's the reason the Messiah died. That's the reason the Messiah died, for what the law could not do. Could we be forgiven for unintentional sins? Absolutely. We just seen in Leviticus 4 and Numbers 15. The Day of Atonement. What was the Day of Atonement about? Most ministers have no idea what it is. Most Jews don't have any idea what it's for. Most people think the Day of Atonement is for all the sins you've committed. My friend, let me explain briefly. That's not even possible. If somebody committed a sin intentionally, what did we just read here in Numbers 15, 30, and 31? Yahweh says you're completely and utterly cut off. He didn't say wait until the Day of Atonement, which may be tomorrow or maybe next week, and then when the goat is offered up, then you'll be forgiven. That's not true. You are completely and utterly cut off. And if somebody sinned unintentionally, what did they do? They offer up a sacrifice, and they are absolutely forgiven. Forgiven. The Messiah didn't die because they were forgiven for unintentional sin. If they committed an intentional sin, there was nothing they can do, and that's the sin the Messiah died for. The Day of Atonement now, what was that for? It wasn't for an intentional sin, because it wasn't for an intentional sin that came to somebody's remembrance. Like if I did a sin yesterday and I thought today, oh wow, what did I do? You offer up a sacrifice. When it comes to your remembrance, you offer up a sacrifice and you are forgiven. And if you sin unintentionally, you're cut off, you're through. A righteous man has to live by faith. I want to talk extensively on that, hopefully now, if not, maybe in the next talk. But if you sin intentionally, was the Day of Atonement for intentional sin? No, my friend. You were completely and utterly cut off. If you intentionally committed adultery, violated a Sabbath, dishonored your father and mother, those are all sins unto death. You don't wait for the Day of Atonement and be forgiven for them. You're completely and utterly cut off. And what was the Day of Atonement for? It was for sins that the community of Israel, all of Israel, not collectively, but every individual in Israel that committed a sin unintentionally that never came to their remembrance, they were still guilty of that sin. They never remembered it, but that's how strongly Yahweh holds sin against people. An unintentional sin somebody committed that never came to their remembrance, they never offered up a sacrifice for it, that's what the Day of Atonement was for. Unintentional sin that people committed that never came to their remembrance. Those are the sins that were forgiven on the Day of Atonement. It was not unintentional sin that came to remembrance that you were forgiven for already by offering up a sacrifice. It wasn't for intentional sin because you were absolutely cut off after that. And how many people in the Bible have sinned intentionally at least one time? We're told 3 times in the Tanakh, the so-called Old Testament, 3 times, all men have sinned. Paul mentions again in Romans chapter 3:23, I believe it is, that all men have sinned and come short of the glory. We've got all men, including Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, of course. Big sin for David. I'm going to talk about that too. But all these men have sinned intentionally. And what do they do about it? There's nothing they can do. That's why, you know what the most important verse in the Bible, next to Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is one. I was sitting in the yeshiva one day when the rabbi talked about Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. He said, this is the most prominent verse in Judaism. All of the commandments come down to Habakkuk 2, verse 4. They say there's 613 commandments. David breaks those 613 down. This is according to Judaism. It's not true, of course, but this is how they break it down. In Psalm 15, David breaks them down to 15 commandments in Psalm 15. Isaiah breaks them down into 5 commandments. Habakkuk, Micah breaks them down into 5. Isaiah breaks them down into 10. I'll talk about it more in the next video. And then Habakkuk breaks all of them down into 1. Habakkuk 2:4. The righteous man shall live by faith. That summarizes the entire Torah in Judaism. The righteous shall live by faith. You know, Paul mentioned that verse 3 times. Because the righteous man, when a righteous man, like in Zechariah and Elizabeth, for instance, in Luke 1 verse 6, chapter 1 verse 6, says they kept all the commandments of Yahweh blamelessly. They were keeping every commandment they were commanded to do blamelessly. Is that Luke 1:6? But they had to live by faith. Why? Did they ever commit a sin intentionally? Absolutely. Because all men have committed at least one sin unintentionally. Most of us, millions of sins intentionally, millions of sins. So did Zechariah and Elizabeth commit one sin intentionally? Absolutely. But now they're keeping all the commandments of Yahweh blamelessly. But what about that one sin they committed intentionally? How could they be reconciled back to Yahweh for that? They can't. They have to live by faith. So the righteous man, somebody keeping the commandments, righteousness, Deuteronomy 6:25, Moses said if you keep these commandments, it'll be considered righteousness for you. In 1 John chapter 3, verses 3 to 10, John makes it very clear that righteousness is keeping the commandments. So the man keeping the commandments has to live by faith because of the sin he committed in the past, the intentional sin he committed in the past. He has to live by faith. Yahweh's going to make a way for him to be reconciled back to the Father, back to himself. And he made that way, the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. I get excited when I think about that passage. The suffering servant of Isaiah 53 that died for the sins of Israel. For what the law could not do, and that's the law could not forgive you for intentional sin. I love to debate some of these so-called rabbis. Tovia Singer, I think of him. He might be a nice man, I'm not saying that, but he's doing the devil's work, that's for sure. When they distort scriptures that they know absolutely they're distorting, that's the devil's work. Or when these so-called Trinitarians or these lawless ministers debate people about the law, and they know that what they're saying is not true. They know it. They've got to know it. When they know it's not true. So my friend, the righteous man lives by faith. The righteous man keeping the commandments has to live by faith that Yahweh will make a way for him to be reconciled back to him for what things that sins that he's committed that he could not be justified for through the law of Moses. Like Paul said in Acts 13:38 and 9. And that way, he made that way through the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53. I want to talk more about that in the next video. I hope I didn't talk too fast here. But anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. And we'll talk more about Isaiah 53 in the next video. And some of the other hard sayings of Paul that people misunderstand that will absolutely cost them their salvation because they're twisting the things Paul said. They're thinking Paul talked disparagingly or against the law. Paul said, I never did that. He obeyed the law. And the Gentiles think the same thing the tens of thousands of Jews in Acts 21 thought, that Paul was doing that. Only Gentiles love it. Wow, that's great. We don't have to obey the law. The Jews got mad and wanted to kill him for saying that because they had a reverence for Yahweh's law. And they wanted to kill him for that. So more in the next video. Again, thank you very much. Shalom.